Thus, in contrast to specific laws, we have universal attraction, or the pure notion of law. Insofar as this pure notion is looked on as the essence, or the true inner being, the determinateness of the specific law itself still belongs to appearance, or rather to sensuous being. But the pure notion of law transcends not merely the law which, being itself a specific law, stands contrasted with other specific laws, but also transcends law as such. The determinateness of which we spoke is itself really only a vanishing moment which can no longer occur here as something essential. For here it is only the law that is the true, but the notion of law is turned against law itself. That is to say, in law, the difference itself is grasped immediately and taken up into the universal, thereby, however, giving the moments whose relation is expressed by the law a subsistence in the form of indifferent and merely implicit essentialities. But these parts of the difference present in the law are at the same time themselves determinate sides. The pure notion of law as universal attraction must, to get its true meaning, be grasped in such a way that in it, as what is absolutely simple or unitary, the differences present in law as such themselves return again into the inner world as a simple unity. This unity is the inner necessity of the law. In the previous sections where Hegel has introduced this notion of law, which held out the promise of being able to carry out the kind of unification that we didn't see force as able to do, a unification for the understanding subject. What we've seen happen is a number of laws were able to be brought under the heading of one law. And here in 151, Hegel is going to explore that dynamic. So what we've got going on is a number of different levels, you might say, all at the same time, and it is consciousness which is able to cognize these and chart out their relationship to each other. He's going to say that the pure notion of law goes against law in a certain way, and so that's going to be the crux of this. How does that come to pass? Well, let's think about what the laws actually do before we go into the text itself. You notice I've got these specific laws here, and there could be a multiplicity of them. There could be 38 specific laws that are all brought under the heading of one particular law, and that usually seems like scientific progress to us, right? If we're able to come up with a unified account, whether it be in physical terms or sociological terms, it seems like we're making some progress by moving towards higher and higher levels of abstraction, not attraction, but abstraction, and getting to the essence of things. Now, the specific laws apply to particular phenomena, and they have that same structure that force had earlier, where there's a realm of things that are different from each other, and force, as it moves out into its expression, out of its interiority, into its being in appearance for us, its exteriority, it extends to and unifies all these particulars. And we saw in the previous discussions that what this does is introduce a flux of difference. So the law is supposed to be something fixed, something in certain ways static, something even eternal, in the change, in the difference, in the flux of the particular appearances, the particular things that we're seeing. And Hegel says that we're able to see them as appearance precisely because of their lawfulness, because they have this being bound together in that way. And then we can go from specific laws. Here in the case of universal attraction, he talks about the laws of celestial bodies, the planets, the suns, the stars, all the other phenomena. The laws that apply to falling bodies here in our own observable existence, whether it be that of ballistics or that of other things. And those can all be brought under the heading of one main process, one main intelligible structure, universal attraction. So that holds out a lot of promise for us, doesn't it? He's using this for an example for a reason. He says, in contrast to specific laws, we have universal attraction, or he says the pure notion of law, but it's not really the pure notion of law, because universal attraction itself is one law among other laws, right? So we not only have multiplicity down here at the level of the particulars, we not only have multiplicity down here at the level of specific laws, we actually, so long as we're dealing with something that has determinateness, we're going to have multiple laws in play so that none of them are really the pure notion of law. So he says, insofar as this pure notion is looked at as the essence or the true inner being, the determinateness of the specific law still belongs to appearance. So where we thought that we were sort of cutting off appearance here at this level, it turns out that all of this is really within the realm of appearance. So physical laws, laws of psychology, laws in whatever sense we want to talk about, so long as they apply to determinate features of experience, to determinate processes, to determinate ranges of being, they are not the pure notion of law itself. So how are we able then to grasp this pure notion of law itself and contrast essence against appearance? That's a very important question. The answer to that, of course, is, well, it's really consciousness that's doing it. It's not law by itself doing it. Consciousness is making a contribution. So he says, the determinateness of which we spoke is itself really only a vanishing moment which can no longer occur here as something essential. For here it is only the law that is the true. And what he means there is the pure notion of law. Again, we see this language of vanishing moments. What we thought we could take for granted as our stopping point for consciousness in its process of examining itself and how it engages with everything else, consciousness has revealed to us that this is not actually such a stable stopping point, that just like everything else, this is going to, when we start pulling on the threads, unravel. So he says, the pure notion of law transcends not merely the law which being itself a specific law stands contrasted with other specific laws, but also transcends law as such. That's a little mind-boggling, isn't it? The notion of something transcends that thing as such. But this is part of the dialectical process. There is a self-transcendence going on, an activity in which law itself is revealing itself through its notion, a notion for the understanding, right, as being more than what we originally took it as. So this is actually a process of gaining something, not just a process of losing, not just a process of vanishing. He says, the notion of law is turned against law itself. That is to say, in the law, the difference itself is grasped immediately and taken up into the universal. So what does that mean? That's pretty strange jargon there. Remember what happens with laws, right? The difference is at the level of the multiple. Those are taken up into a universal. That can happen not only in terms of law and phenomena, but also in terms of laws and a greater law. And then it can happen in terms of more universal laws and law itself. They're taken up into this universal, giving the moments whose relation is expressed by the law, right? The moments are supposed to be connected with each other in certain ways. The law is supposed to be structuring that, expressing it. That's why we wanted laws in the first place, because it was providing us with a certain intelligibility. He says it gives them a subsistence in the form of indifferent and merely implicit essentialities. So indifferent and merely implicit essentialities. When we're looking at the world and we're looking at things and we're trying to make sense of them through this notion, through this activity, you might even say, of law. We are trying to hold on to their determinateness. The reason why we want to have laws about things is not so that we can turn them all, like, via some great metaphysical blender into the same dull gray soup. It's so that we can preserve what we actually have, but also understand the essential structure of what we have. We want the essence, but we also want the appearance. The problem here is that the very working of law has a tendency to flatten everything out, to turn differences into those that are merely indifferent, those that don't matter, those that don't really make a difference, as we've said before. So he says these parts of the difference present in the law are at the same time determinate sides. So the pure notion of law as universal attraction must, to get to its true meaning, be grasped in such a way that in it, what is absolutely simple or unitary? What is absolutely simple or unitary in this? Here Hegel's going to say something kind of tricky, isn't he? The differences present in law as such themselves return again into the inner world as a simple unity. So what is unity? Unity is actually the whole set of differences. He's talking about totality as well as unity here. And all of that has to be sort of taken up into this notion of law, he says. So this unity is the inner, and here he introduces a key term, necessity of the law. Why talk about necessity? Again, I want to remind us that when we're talking about the meaning of law, what we're talking about is something that the mind can grasp that brings intelligibility to this wide range of phenomena. Ultimately, if it's supposed to be the law governing everything, if it's the unconditioned universal we've been seeking, it actually has to bring intelligibility to everything. Now, how is that possible? What do we require in order to have intelligibility? In a lot of cases, we can have things that are contingent be intelligible. So I'm going to, walk around now, right, or flip my tie. Why am I doing it? That's a contingent action. We could actually explain it in terms of, well, Dr. Sadler wanted to demonstrate what a contingent action was, so he flipped his tie, and the tie happened to be in the right place at the right time. You notice what's happening. All these different sort of causal relations and factors are coming together in a way that allows this action to happen, right? It's silly action, right? Almost something out of Laurel and Hardy or the Three Stooges. But what does this illustrate to us? Why was I doing that? I wanted to illustrate something about intelligibility. Somehow there's a connection between these. Hegel would call that necessity. There are different ranges, different, you might say, amounts or degrees of necessity for Hegel. Necessity and intelligibility interfuse with each other. So when something is arbitrary, Willkür in German, dependent on the will or just dependent on something happening, by chance, we really don't understand it. This is an idea that goes all the way back to antiquity. When Aristotle is talking about seeking out the causes of things, he's talking about trying to find some manner of necessity. And that has to do with grasping the essence of things, not merely the appearances, grasping the essence that runs through those appearances. When Cicero, rejects the views of the Epicureans in the De Fato, saying, look, whenever we actually have something intelligible, there has to be some cause for it. He is, Hegel would say, dimly seeking the same sort of thing that Hegel is more explicitly and articulately setting out for us. So we want necessity, and Hegel thinks that we're really only going to get this through the pure notion of law, not through these other laws which are easier for us to handle. The law is thereby present in a twofold manner. once as law in which the differences are expressed as independent moments, and also in the form of a simple withdrawal into itself, which again can be called force, but in the sense not of a force that is driven back into itself, but force as such, or the notion of force, an abstraction which absorbs the differences themselves of what attracts and what is attracted. In this sense, simple electricity, for example, is force, but the expression of difference falls within the law. This difference is positive and negative electricity. In the case of the motion of falling, force is the simple factor. Gravity, whose law is that the magnitudes of the different moments of the motion, the time elapsed and the space traversed, are related to one another as root and square. Electricity itself is not difference per se, or is not in its essence the dual essence of positive and negative electricity. Hence, it is usually said that it has the law of this mode of being, and two, that it has the property of expressing itself in this way. It is true that this property is the essential and sole property of this force, or that it belongs to it necessarily. But necessity here is an empty word. Force must, just because it must, duplicate itself in this way. Of course, given positive electricity, negative too is given in principle, for the positive is only as related to a negative, or the positive is in its own self, the difference from itself, and similarly with the negative. But that electricity as such should divide itself in this way is not in itself a necessity. Electricity as simple force is indifferent to its law, to be positive and negative. And if we call the former its notion, but the latter its being, then its notion is indifferent to its being. It merely has this property, which just means that this property is not in itself necessary to it. This indifference is given another form when it is said that to be positive and negative belongs to the definition of electricity, and that this is simply its notion and essence. In that case, its being would simply mean its actual existence. But that definition does not contain the necessity of its existence. It exists either because we find it, that is, its existence is not necessary at all, or else it exists through or by means of other forces. That is, its necessity is an external necessity. But in basing this necessity on the determinateness of being through another, we relapse again into the plurality of specific laws, which we have just left behind in order to consider law as law. It is only with law as law that we are to compare its notion as notion or its necessity. But in all these forms, necessity has shown itself to be only an empty word. In section 152, Hegel is going to be exploring, along with us, this understanding of the relationship between necessity and law. And it's very easy to automatically assume that, well, if there's a law for something that provides us with total necessity, that's what it means to have a law. But if we start exploring the way that laws are conceptualized and how they apply to the ranges of things, that within the realm of appearance they do, we find that although there is often the appearance of necessity, at least at this point, we're not arriving at something that we can say is in fact a robust necessity. So Hegel is going to tell us that law itself splits into two sides. He says it's present in a twofold manner. He says it's present as a law, in which the differences are expressed as independent moments, and also in the form of a simple withdrawal into itself, which again can be called force. And he wants to specify here, because he's reintroducing this notion of force. Not force, he says, that is driven back into itself, but force as such, the notion of force. And what is that? That's an abstraction that absorbs differences. So when we have a law, we already have this conception of force at work, and it really is a conception. It's an abstraction. The law gives us these differences to which the law is somehow supposed to get its hooks. It's supposed to extend to these. It's supposed to cover them all. It's supposed to bind them all into sort of a conceptual unity for us, in which the differences become really indifferent. And then the force as such is supposed to somehow take these differences and absorb them. So, you could think of this as the working of law. This is what is required for law to actually function. It gets a little bit easier to wrap our heads around this when we look at the examples that he's providing. And if we don't look at the examples that he's providing, we won't actually get through the insights that are coming out of them. So he says, in this sense, simple electricity, for example, is force, right? It is an abstraction that absorbs differences. When we use the word electricity and we have some sort of conception, we're not thinking necessarily in terms of positive and negative, although that's going to turn out to be really, really important when we're actually trying to do anything in the world with electricity, or to explain things like, why did the lightning hit over there? We have to think in terms of positive and negative, and that falls under the law, the explanation, the regularity that's going on. Then we say that the force expresses itself in this way, in terms of positive and negative. With electricity, you don't get, 5 different flavors or something like that, and they are in relation to each other as positive and negative, not just as blue and red or, other kinds of opposites. They are opposed to each other through polarity, right? So he says, the expression of difference falls within the law. This difference is positive and negative electricity. Or we would probably say, positive and negative charge. And you could include other things in there. How are the positive and the negative related to each other? We can get much more, specific about this, but Hegel doesn't want to get into all those sort of details at this point. So he says, in the case of the motion of falling, right? We're thinking about, say, projectiles, or dropping a piece of chalk, or planets, whatever. Satellite orbiting a planet. We have a force, and we call that force gravity. Now, does gravity express itself in the same form? See, what's going on here is we not only have different content, positive and negative, we have a different form. The positive is related to the negative in a different way than time is related to space or to magnitude. You could really say all 3 of these are fitting in together. I know that for Hegel, time and space are already connected with magnitude. Just put that aside for a moment. The reason why I put 3 here is I wanted to really stress that we're dealing with a different form here, not just different content. I mean, positive and negative are definitely different content than time or magnitude or space. But these things are related to each other in very different ways. We have a difference of content, and we have a fundamental difference of form between the ways in which these 2 laws governing things are expressing themselves. What does that mean? Well, there's some implications for that. So let's follow them out. He says, force is the simple factor, gravity, the magnitudes, etc., right? Electricity itself is not difference per se, or is not in its essence the dual essence of positive and negative electricity. This is the essence of it, right? Hence, it's usually said that it has the law of this mode of being, and it has the property of expressing itself this way. So we have a phenomenon, it has to express itself in a determinate way. He says, it is true that this property is the essential and sole property of this force, or that it belongs to it necessarily. So we think that we have some sort of necessity here, right? If you've got electricity, then you have to have positive and negative. That's the rules of the game if you're dealing with electricity. You can try to make up other rules, but now you're not dealing with electricity, you've got some other thing in mind, right? Likewise, motion of falling, there's a certain necessity here. And we can even say there's a certain intelligibility that is correlative to that necessity, right? We can conceptualize it, and we can plan, and we can explain it to somebody else and feel like we know what we're talking about, precisely because these things are connected with each other. It has the property, right? So he says, it's true that this belongs to it necessarily, but necessity here is an empty word. What does he mean by that? Well, there's necessity, and then you might say there's necessity with a capital N. Real necessity. Necessity that conditions necessity. I should have probably not done the capital N here, but too late for that, right? What would provide us with that? Well, let's follow this out a little bit more. He says, of course, given positive electricity, negative is given to in principle, for the positive is only as related to a negative, right? But that electricity as such should divide itself in this way is not in itself a necessity. What could make it a necessity? Well, you would need something else structuring electricity and saying you got to do things this way. Imagine, we're dealing with a level of bosses. Electricity bosses around the phenomena and says, here's the way I want things done. Forms need to be filled out in positive and negative, right? That's the way activities work. But, there's a bigger boss, and you can say, well, the bigger boss is the one who said that this actually has to go this way. How do you get in that office and find the bigger boss? That's the question. So he says, it just has this property, right? The notion of electricity is indifferent to its being. It merely has this property, which means that this property is not in itself necessary to it. This indifference is given another form when it is said to be positive and negative belongs to the definition of electricity, and that this is simply its notion in essence. But he says, in that case, its being would simply mean its actual existence. But that's not what we're trying to get at, just the sheer facticity of it. We want to understand it, right? We want to make sense of it. So he says, that definition does not contain the necessity of its existence. It exists either because we find it, and if we just happen to run across it, that's not necessary. That's not contributing necessity to us. Or it exists through and by means of other forces. Right? And we can say the same thing, by the way, about gravity. Why does it have to show itself in this way? Why does it have to structure things along these lines? Well, there has to be something else governing this. And that would provide us with real necessity, wouldn't it? But we don't have that. We encounter electricity, we encounter gravity, we conceptualize them. Have we gotten behind those to the force governing all of those? Not yet, we certainly haven't. Or have we? He says, in basing this necessity on the determinateness of being through another, we relapse again into the plurality of specific laws which we've just left behind in order to consider law as law, right? So we're placed back after doing a bit of investigation in a similar starting point. Now, whenever Hegel does that, you notice that it's never quite exactly the same starting point. Things don't just repeat themselves over and over again in a cycle. It's more like a spiral where we get closer and closer and closer to the center. But we've now realized that these specific laws, where we thought we had some necessity going on, because of the very structure of law, we don't actually have necessity. The truth, the essence of law is not yet available to us. He says, in all these forms, necessity has shown itself to be only an empty word. Does that mean that we don't have any necessity to look for, that necessity doesn't mean anything? No, because the process of study is not yet finished. But it means that we don't have it at this point, and we don't have it where other people are saying that it is because they've stopped at that point. Hegel wants to go on farther.